also spent a lot of time rewriting history in lecturing the public as to the mistakes made by prior Federal Reserves in being too trigger happy when it came to fighting inflation that turned out to be transitory. But at the time, the Fed officials feared that it wasn't transitory, and so they moved preemptively, and that ended up being the wrong thing. And Powell said that he doesn't want to risk making that mistake. First of all, none of those prior mistakes, the way Powell described it, happened while the Fed was at zero, right? There isn't a prior period of time where the Fed had interest rates at zero. So even if it turns out, which it's not, but even if it turned out that inflation is actually transitory, even if that's the case, that doesn't justify keeping interest rates at zero. Nothing justifies keeping interest rates at zero except my explanation that the Fed knows if they raise rates, the economy is going to crash, and so they're not raising them. And if they raise them later, it'll crash even harder, so they're never going to raise them. That is the only viable explanation for the Fed's failure to act, not the idea that inflation is transitory, because even if it was, that doesn't justify keeping interest rates at 0% now. But more importantly, Powell's history lesson is wrong. He is rewriting history. There is no history of Fed chairmen being too aggressive on fighting inflation. History shows that the opposite is true. They're always too dovish. They're never too tight. The only time we really had tight money was under Paul Volcker, and that's not the policy that Powell is criticizing. In fact, he has praised the policies of Paul Volcker. He's just somehow criticizing everybody else without specifically naming names. The one period in history where Powell did acknowledge that the Fed got it wrong as far as they thought the inflation was transitory, and it turned out not to be, was during the 1970s. But the most ridiculous part about that admission is what Powell blames the higher inflation on. Powell said that the Fed was correct in assuming inflation was transitory because the big increase in food and energy prices reversed. So you had this big spike up in oil and food, and then at some point oil prices and food prices started to come down. So supposedly, according to Powell, that vindicated the Fed, that they were right. But then what happened was that core consumer prices kept going up anyway. Even though food and energy prices started to come down, all the other prices started to go up. And Powell blames that on the public. He said what happened was the public began expecting inflation. And because the public began to expect inflation, we had inflation. In other words, the public basically willed the inflation into existence. The mere fact that the public expected inflation, they ended up delivering on those expectations by raising prices or demanding higher wages. So he blamed it on the public, which of course is nonsense. What Powell didn't want to acknowledge, or maybe he doesn't even understand, is why we actually had really high inflation in the 1970s, because we're going to have even more inflation now, even higher inflation now, for the same reasons. It wasn't the public's fault for the 1970s. It was the Fed's fault. What did the Fed do wrong in the 1960s and the 1970s that contributed to all that inflation? They printed too much money. They printed a bunch of money during the 1960s in order to finance large government deficits. Where'd those deficits come from? Well, they came from Lyndon Johnson, who was implementing his Great Society programs. Medicare and Medicaid never existed before, rolled those things out. We launched the war on poverty. We had the Vietnam War. By the way, we lost both those wars. Poverty won the war on poverty. And, we lost Vietnam, but we spent a lot of money losing those wars. We funded the space race, right? We had the Apollo missions. We went to the moon. All this stuff was done with borrowed money and printed money. And then we went off the gold standard. 1971, we defaulted on our promise to redeem Federal Reserve notes in gold to foreign governments who had trusted us and who were holding our notes as reserve. So we did all this stuff. And that's why we had all this inflation. It had nothing to do with what the public expected. They didn't get inflation because they expected it. They got inflation because the Fed created it. And the only reason they expected it was because they were living it. Maybe what some people didn't expect was for Paul Volcker to go medieval on inflation and actually let rates go to 20%. That might have been one of the only things the public didn't expect. And so probably a lot of people in the late 1970s, early 80s, expected that high rate of inflation to continue, but it didn't continue because Paul Volcker unexpectedly did the right thing, which is probably the last time anyone at the Fed ever did the right thing. But Powell's revisionist history lesson proves that he doesn't understand the mistakes that the Fed made in the past, which is why he doesn't understand the mistakes that he's making in the present. And the inflation that we are going to experience again in this decade is going to be far worse than what was experienced during the 1970s, because the Fed now is making the same mistakes as it did back then, only on a bigger scale. The current Fed is monetizing even larger deficits than the Fed did back then. So even more inflation has to be created now than was created then. And it's happening at a time where the U.S. economy is much more leveraged than it was during the 1960s. I mean, we didn't have anywhere near this degree of leverage. America was still a creditor nation. It wasn't a debtor nation. We had a huge industrial base. We had massive trade surpluses back in the 1970s. We didn't have these huge trade deficits that we have today. The economy is a shadow of what it used to be. It's just a gigantic bubble. We had a real viable economy back then, and we still managed to have the stagflation of the 1970s. So if we had stagflation in the 70s when we had a much stronger economy, imagine what we're going to have now when we have a much weaker economy. We have a much bigger bubble, and the Fed is creating even more inflation now than it did then.